All right, so the images that you're looking at right now are of a piece that I described as notes towards a poetry and poetics of the phenomenology and social experience of dysgraphia. And then what I'm creating is viewers that are very close readers and familiar with my set lists and serial work will recognize this particular box as belonging to the way that one can reference points in time in any YouTube video by running the cursor along the bottom of the time marker, the line, from which you can get to any point in a video. Now I'm at 55 seconds, and this is the image that appears there in this particular piece. But what I like to do is utilize these images as alternative ways of looking at a piece, so that you can have a moment in one time referring to either a larger background of that moment, or you can run the cursor over this way and see I have a completely different moment referring to a larger background moment. And I call these constructed pieces variation in variation, which plays on the title of a piece. Called Spiegel in Spiegel, and Spiegel in Spiegel means mirror in mirror, or it's the idea of the infinity of regressive images that occur, when a mirror is placed beside another mirror, and it references a musical piece by Arvo Part, and I've used the idea of mirror in mirror, variously to describe ideas of infinity, infinitude, and also notions of egocentricity and to play with ideas in set theory. The idea of a set that either contains multiple infinitudes of itself or fails to include itself, and these playlists that make up my YouTube page, or make up an element of my YouTube page, a reflection that the way that we organize elements of sets, and the way that we organize elements of society, human beings, and the way that we organize objects in space and time are profoundly hierarchized and profoundly significative, right, in multiple ways, and so they involve ideas of sorting, but also of the placements of certain kinds of sorting in both physical space and semiotic or semantic space, and both semiotic and physical space, have economic entailments that relate to what is available for certain positionalities. That is, what resources one has access to, and where something belongs or where something doesn't belong, and what's inside and outside the law. And I don't know if everyone always gets that that's what's going on, but that's what's going on. And one of the reasons why I do pieces like this, where I go back and look at some of these ideas, is so that I can underscore and clarify some of that. So in this piece that I'm now presenting as a variation in variation, and that plays with all of those other ideas that I just mentioned, what I essentially did was I started to compose a list of the reasons why I lost certain jobs. I think I began with the earliest jobs that I had, and I don't even think that I got as far as my undergraduate, college jobs in this. This was all, but I may be wrong. There may be other examples of work in here that go beyond my high school years, but a lot of these jobs, that I had, I lost because of inability to perform the duties of those jobs, and a lot of those jobs. And a lot of those duties, involved to some degree or another, tidy handwriting and a certain way of being able to organize the world, which I was unable to do to perform the duties of that job. So I guess in some ways this is a description of jobs, but it also plays with, it's kind of a pun, it plays with this idea of the trials of Job in the Old Testament, and by enacting the performance of my writing and its difficulties, I'm both demonstrating the propositions that I'm narrating, and giving a kind of experience to the audience, the viewer, that who are capable of putting up with this lengthy amount of time that it takes to follow the writing, in order to, because you can really only read this text that I'm producing here if you read it letter by letter. And to read it letter by letter, you have to, along with me, follow the difficulties that I'm having in transcribing those letters. So I'm giving you an experience, and like most things, most audience of this kind of work won't be able to sit through it. So you won't be able to read. You won't be able to read it, right? Because you won't have the patience. But and some people will question why I would make the demand of them to have such patience. And the answer is very simple. It's that this is the demand that's always placed upon me whenever I'm asked to write, right? So when I'm asked to, take a test, when I'm asked to write the assignment, or let's say the one of the requirements for a college course is that you fill out a blue book for this particular class. There's going to be a midterm, or there's going to be a final, and you bring in your blue books, and you have to answer the questions. And this is what it looks like for me to do that. So the reason that I ask my audience to suffer through this is simply because that gives you an understanding of what it is to exist in the social space that asks for these kinds of activities, and that fails to make allowance for difference in those areas. And I expect, just like I expect in my life, that when I explain this to individuals, that they nod, and they shake their head in agreement, and then very promptly they forget, and then ask me to fill out a form, like restating this or something. And we've I've gone over that a bunch of times, but anyway, so it both places me in this position of performatively enacting the trials of Job, and it places the audience in the same position, or a similar position, having to decode this, as well as to participate in its time, right? And it does so through a lot of means that allude to different things that may or may not be going on in the background. For example, there's diegetic music playing in this particular piece that I've muted, so that I could speak over this. But it's an album by Burning Spear, Winston, Rodney, and I think it's a best of Burning Spear. So it's a collection, and it begins with this tune, Social Living, and the don't you know social living is the best, and it means one thing in Burning Spear, and of course like there's a certain degree of irony in it, in its relationship to this piece, right? Because the problem of writing is one of fitting in socially, and it may be the best, but it's not the easiest, right? And you can see me struggling with all of this. The piece itself is 46 minutes and 38 seconds, and it contains very little information, right? Just a few brief summaries of my job experience. So I think of it as like summary of a list of brief summaries of why I lost particular jobs, and then playing with different music. And I was trying to get in the performance of the piece, I was trying to get the finale to coincide with the end of the music, and I certainly could have gone on, but I reached a point where it felt like a conclusion, so we didn't get the final musical piece. I think I wrote about that in the description. So that's part of what's going on here. This play with job, and a summary of lost jobs, and a kind of enactment of this of why, and playing with that pun on the trials of Job as job, and a lot of these jobs that I lost, or failed, to be able to, perform, completely, didn't have job summaries. That is, didn't have like brief descriptions of the duties of the job, to begin with. Well, these were, very basic jobs. I think some of them, not all of them, but a lot of the assumptions were, that if you can graduate from high school, you should have the skills to perform all of the tasks that this job entails, and we don't really need to provide a job summary or a description. But that wasn't necessarily the case, given my particular set of abilities, and limitations in certain kinds of abilities. So that's another interesting aspect of the piece, and anyway, that's a long preamble to the topic that I wanted to begin with today, and suggest that this piece that this preamble that I'm performing for this particular piece is leading up to the idea that regular jobs and jobs inside the academy, and even sometimes in other aspects of art, have these job summaries or job descriptions attached to them. Now you can put a job description in your resume, and ironically, I once had a job that a big part of the job was creating resumes for individuals with all different kinds of disabilities. and I was actually pretty good at it, but I didn't have to fill anything out by hand. But there are job descriptions that go into resumes, but there are also job descriptions that individuals who are looking for people to fill positions, right? So not a lot of these jobs that I'm describing in this piece had those, but certainly later jobs did, although they didn't necessarily accurately define them. I had a job working in a tribal TANF, and the description of the job was that it entailed, something like 20% of the job was going to be, filling out paperwork. Well, it really was more like 60% of the job was filling out paperwork. So putting all these numbers and names into these columns and rows was, nearly impossible for me. So that I'm not sure if that was one of the jobs that I mentioned in this, but if it was, much later than high school, and much later in my the history of my loss of jobs. So, sorry, I've lost where I was going with that. Not really sure where I was going with that. I'm describing a job that I lost at McDonald's here. In any case, oh yes, I recall where I was now in my discourse. The point at which I got lost was I was describing a job that I had at Tribal TANF in California at PALA, and my inability to perform the duties of that job because of my difficulties in writing, and that job did have a job description, so it had a job summary, but the job summary was inaccurate in terms of the amount of time that one actually had to spend engaged in filling out this paperwork. Some of which one could fill out on computer, and some of which one had to fill out by hand. And I had difficulty, with both of those tasks. But in any case, I thought it would be interesting for the purposes of this piece to create and I don't intend to do it in a concise and precise manner, the way that it would be done, if one were looking for someone to fill a professional position. But I thought it would be interesting to create a kind of job summary for the kind of individual that my artwork requires as a reader and interpreter. And as you can see from this piece, one of the requirements would be, a great amount of patience and the ability to sit through lengthy periods of silence or sustained perceptual attentiveness, because there's a lot that's going on that may not be readily apparent in this work, but in addition to following letter by letter and being able to decode the textual representation of the statements that I'm making here, you have to be paying attention, developing a relationship to the way that I shape letters, but you also really need to to fully experience the emotional impact of the piece, see how the writing begins to deteriorate as it goes along, like what stages of the writing do you see these disintegrations of carefulness in crafting these letters, because typically you begin with, as a dysgraphic, I'll begin with a certain amount of clarity, and then the clarity gets lost as I continue with the writing. So to fully get the piece, you have to experience that while you're simultaneously decoding. And again, and at this metacognitive level, be able to relate that, to my experience. And then, in my, job summary for a potential viewer, which, artists don't usually create, right? But because for a lot of reasons, but my job summary for a potential viewer would necessarily require someone with a lot of patience. So let's just go ahead and begin this job description, and we'll call it job summary for artists interpreter. This job requires patience. This job requires sensitivity. This job requires a certain amount of empathy. This job requires a certain amount of visual acuity. This job requires an ability to decipher code. This job requires a familiarity with a wide variety of discourses, including philosophy, psychology, economics, mathematics, literature, biological sciences, art history, social history, geography, and other areas of intellectual engagement, including semiotics, film theory, music theory, and pedagogical theory. Interpreters of this art will be expected to make decisions in acts of communication and interpretation across a wide range of materials, subjects, contents, and varieties of expression, including but not limited to textual representations of writing, sculpture, performance artworks, theater, painting, cinema, poetry, and a number of different varieties and forms of art making, which falls somewhat betwixt and between any of these domains and genres. An ideal applicant for the position of interpretation of this art would be one capable of engaging the art in acts of communication and seeing those acts of communication as processes in time over perhaps decades worth of work. To further define communication, applicants would be expected to respond to the work and receive responses from the work, engaging those responses in dialogue across extended periods of time. Ideal applicants in the interpretation of the work would be willing to enter the field of the work in multiple ways. Ideal applicants for the position of interpreter of the work would have interests in social constructivism, disability theory, radical politics, social engagement, activism, and issues of social justice. Ideal applicants for the position of interpreter would be willing to question the assumptions behind a number of different categories and forms of thinking, making, and building, including but not limited to the epistemological assumptions within and supporting basic acts of art making, such as drawing, organizing, placing in space, the assumptions behind gallery space as both economic and social information, storage, reception, and exchange. The ideal candidate would, for the position of interpretation, would understand that the engagement with the various pieces of art are at least partially dependent upon what the interpreter places there, and that acts of communication with the art are more relevant by far than the justification of the authority of a discourse regarding the art as an object. Meaning that the more that communication is made, the more understanding and the depth of understanding will become a process as the work and the communication evolve. an ideal interpreter of this particular work of art will not be fastidiously interested in the minutiae of craft and will not have an epistemological focus that centers the idea of talent. The ideal receiver and interpreter of this art will be able to put up with a lot of background noise from animals and the environment and recognize that the content of noise is a result of economic relationships that the work is also interested in interrogating. In that way, the ideal receiver of the art and interpreter of the art will have read Virginia Woolf's A Room of Her Own. The ideas presented in this particular job summary are in no way exhaustive and merely touch upon the expectations that the art will demand of the interpreter applying for this particular position.